All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Welcome to Libraries and Learning Analytics, Facts, False Choices, and Future Forays. As Gina Parsons-Diamond of ACRL mentioned, this is brought to you from the University Library Section's Professional Development Committee. We're really delighted to have you and most of all our presenters with us today. I'm Laura Garapi. I'm a co-chair of the committee, and I'll be helping introduce and kind of close out this program. And I've also got my fellow committee member, Leanne Romaine, with me today, who will be helping, hi Leanne, moderate questions and dole them back out to our presenters as appropriate in today's session. And this is one of an ongoing series of programs from ACRL's ULS Professional Development Committee. And I'm dropping that link in the chat. Now I have to say, we're about to schedule our slate of the next year's presentation. So if it looks a little sparse, that would be why, but you can get a sense of some of the historical programming we've offered and look forward to more in the future. Before we jump in, just to touch base on a few logistics and reiterating a couple of things that Gina already mentioned, the session is being recorded. We'll send out a link of the video and any additional content that the presenters would like to share, including slides or other supplemental documentation as they see fit. The program's an hour total, including time for questions. And if you'd like to drop questions throughout today's session, as I said, my colleague Leanne will be gathering those, so don't hesitate to share them as you've got them, and we'll make sure they make their way back to our presenters. Gina also mentioned with the chat feature, it does default to sending it to panelists only. So when you chat the group, please switch that to everyone so we can all see what you're sharing as a group. In order to increase accessibility, we are using Zoom's auto caption feature during the presentation. At the bottom of your screen, if you hover, you should see an option to adjust live captions, including hiding them if that's your preference. Before I introduce today's presenters, just giving you a chance to review what you see on the slide before you, some ground rules for productive discourse. We expect everyone to follow these today and really appreciate your cooperation in doing so. Just to review those verbally in addition to visually, we expect everyone here today to please be committed to learning from each other, listen to each other and not talk at each other, acknowledge differences in backgrounds and perspectives and realize that those differences will increase our awareness and understanding of this content, not devalue people or their experiences, lack of experiences, or difference in interpretation of those experiences. Trust that people are doing the best that they can, and please challenge ideas and not individuals. We appreciate you keeping those ideas at the forefront of your mind as you're interacting throughout today's session. So with all that out of the way, on to what you're really here for. Really happy to start today's program. I'll just very briefly introduce our presenters and then they can share more as they see fit about themselves. Megan Oakleaf is an associate professor at Syracuse University's iSchool. She's the PI of 2 IMLS grants on libraries and learning analytics, library integration in institutional learning analytics, and connecting libraries and learning analytics for student success. Ken Varnum is a senior program manager in library information technology at the University of Michigan. He's the technical lead for the IMLS Library Learning Analytics project and works with the library's analytics, data retention, and access processes. And finally, Becky Croxton, head of assessment at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte's Library, is the PI for a campus-wide student success initiative focused on quantifying the role of student engagement in the library and with other co-curricular and extracurricular activities. So finally, I will give you the presenters. Take it away, y'all. Thank you so much for being here.
Well, and thank you, Laura, Leanne, and Gina for supporting us and for giving us an opportunity to speak with all of you. I'm so excited to see how many participants we have in the room with us. So I'm eager to hear your questions, thoughts, suggestions, and concerns, and all of that as we go through the session. I get to kick off. I'm very pleased to do that. And then later we'll hear from Ken and Becky. So the overview for the next 55 minutes or so is this. We want to open the session with some current definitions and common models for learning analytics, talk about the purposes of learning analytics for student learning, discuss some tricky spaces in this field because there are many. We're going to sort of pause at that point and engage you in some thinking about some user stories, research questions, and data sources related to learning analytics work in libraries. And then we'll close out by talking about the unique roles that libraries can play in this space, some next steps for research and practice, and finally give some suggestions for some readings that you might want to engage with, and some discussion questions that you might want to engage with your colleagues in your libraries, and of course also across your institution. So that's the roadmap for today. Becky, can you advance? Thanks. And this is why we're doing this, the outcomes. So we're hoping that by the end of this hour, you'll be able to define learning analytics in a higher education context, describe the purpose for learning analytics and pitfalls as an approach to supporting student learning, and finally start those conversations with those conversations with your colleagues, again, in the library and at your institution, your educational partners on campus. And so that's our intent over the next hour. All right, so let's kick it off with some definitions. It's late morning for me, early afternoon for some of you, so time for definitions. I want to acknowledge the content for many of the definitions and ideas in this section of the presentation came from the 2 grants that Laura mentioned that I've been able to spearhead with my colleagues on this session and others in this space, and they are acknowledged here on this slide. We're very grateful to IMLS for providing those funds. The first grant was one that brought together dozens of leaders in libraries and also experts in learning analytics across higher education to discuss what library engagement and learning analytics might look like. And the second one focuses on how to connect disparate library systems in order to emit data in a standard format, but also engaged in the value questions and the privacy questions around this work. Next slide. Thank you. Okay, so what do we mean by learning analytics? And this is really, really important for our next period of time together, because this term gets used really loosely in libraries and less loosely in other parts of higher education. And so we wanted to frame this conversation in the context of the definition that is common across higher ed, so that you could, at the end of this, be able to operationalize those outcomes about having conversations across campus. So learning analytics in libraries is sometimes used as a synonym for learning assessment or information literacy assessment or value studies that are one-off correlation studies. None of those things translate to learning analytics across the rest of higher education. And if we're going to have those cross-campus conversations, we need to understand the definition that our colleagues will be using. So for this discussion, we're using this definition: the use of institutional level systems that collect individual level student learning data, centralize it in a record store, and serve as a unified source for research seeking to understand and support student success. So what might that look like? On the next slide, there's a sort of basic looking graphic of what learning analytics might look like according to that definition. So on the left-hand side, you'll see different sources of data that campus generates and emits: student information system data, operations data, LMS data, Ipas data, and all other kinds of data coming from different sources on campus. With learning analytics, the intent is to centralize that information, that data, in an institutional record store, data repository. It goes by different names on different campuses: data lake, lots of data water metaphors. And in that space, it's protected by policies, procedures, practices, personnel like privacy officers, technical security, and of course, governance and oversight. The intent of bringing all of that data together is to analyze it according to queries and questions and problems that need solved that are phrased as active research questions in a space. So researchers and educators that have access permissions would be able to connect with that data, run queries, explore questions that need answered on campus. And of course, that requires human eyes, right? We don't want to set something and forget it. So we need to continually assess that data because it comes from human sources that can have lots of flaws and biases in them, and make sure that that's continually assessed so that we can use that data to understand the engagements that students have that point to or away from success as they define it. So the endpoint user of that data is on the right-hand side of the screen. So you might visualize that data for students, faculty, institutional decision makers, advisors, and you can see some of the purposes there on the screen. So for students facilitating metacognition and agency, faculty want to improve their courses and curriculum. An institution wants to get rid of hindrances to student learning and success and maximize facilitators. Advisors want to connect students with things they need, right? The two areas that are in navy blue go to the point that for the most part, generally speaking, library data at this point is not included in these systems, nor do librarians typically have insights and visualizations tailored to their needs. So this is a space that I anticipate the profession may move into, and so that's why we need to know the sort of foundational information that we're discussing today. Okay, next slide. A couple things I wanted to make sure to call out. First of all, the intent here is in the analysis to yield shared understandings about what helps or hinders students' success. And the intent there is to make systemic changes at the macro level for cohorts of students or all students, and also make individual level connections for individual students. One of the important things about this is also that by working together as an educational team across campus, we can leverage our shared capacities, the people that have the skills and the time to do this work, and also increase access to insights. This is really important from an equity issue across different types of institutions and library types. Not all institutions, in fact, very few institutions have the personnel skills and time to do this kind of work unilaterally in the library. And so by working together as a team, we can make it possible for libraries that don't necessarily have that staff, or the staff don't have time or the exact skills they need to do this work, can still engage and benefit, and as can their students. Next slide. And then maybe the most important thing about this is, which can get buried in all these arrows, right, and boxes, is that the purpose of this is to give data back to students so that they can take control additionally of their educational journey so that they have agency over it. Okay, next slide. I also want to acknowledge a subset that doesn't look exactly like the learning analytics picture I just created, but which many of you might be engaged with or hearing about on your campuses. And those are Ipas Systems. Ipas stands for Integrated Planning and Advising for Student Success. You see some logos here of some sort of supplier, vendor supplied solutions. Some campuses also build their own. That last one is my very fancy image of a homegrown system. It's not an official logo. The intent behind Ipas Systems is to connect students with their educational support. So they intend to combine advising alerts, interventions, degree planning, and so on to bring the educational team together, to give students insight into their data, give them agency and choice, and facilitate near real-time connections, recognizing that sometimes what students need can't wait 2 or 3 weeks or to the end of the term, that these connections need to be made right away. So I wanted to acknowledge that as a subset, a flavor of learning analytics that many of you might be encountering on your campuses. Okay, next. So what is the point? What is the point of all this? The intent of learning analytics is to help educators discover, diagnose, and predict challenges to learning and learner success so that they can create or deploy active interventions to benefit students. Interventions is a very sort of unpleasant word. I want to acknowledge that right off the bat. And it sounds experimental and definitely not like something I'm sure that I want to have done to me. But the intent there is to do something. So the goal here is to understand the learning environment and how learners are engaging with the learning environment to try to get rid of hurdles, maximize facilitators, understand better what leads to success, and so on. So about those interventions, let's go to the next slide. So what is an intervention? Can you tell I don't like that word? It's basically, in a nutshell, doing something, right? Engaging in some way, connecting in some way, communicating in some way. And sometimes, as I said earlier, these might be macro level, like for an entire cohort of students or all students, to sort of clear away those hurdles, those obstacles, to make systemic and structural changes to practices, procedures, and policies and processes on our campuses, to sort of smooth the path, right? So to discover what's getting in students' ways and get rid of those things. So that would be at a sort of a group of student level. And then the other intention is to facilitate individual level communication and connection. Many of us are familiar with situations in which we encounter students that want to connect with services that are available on our campus, and yet they are either unaware or don't know how to make the connection, or they tried to make the connection and somewhere along the line it fell through. And so that's one of the things that these systems can do. Also, really importantly, and maybe most importantly, is that it can provide learners with insights into their own learning behaviors, how they are comparing against their stated goals, or maybe their peers, if that's something they want to sort of get a general sense of. It can notify students about milestones or patterns or events so that they can be aware of those things and not have them go under the radar, so to speak, and connect with their educational support system over that. It encourages students to gain assistance when they decide to, when it's needed, and basically otherwise sort of serve as a facilitator, connecting students on campus to the resources and services they want, need, etc. So what can we do as librarians with learning analytics data if we engage in this space? Well, there are two lengthy reports that go with these grants that spell those things out, but I wanted to just call out a couple things really quickly before my time is up. One of the things that we can do is really answer questions about and with students. In the Lila report, there are, I think, more than 30 questions that were brainstormed, but that's certainly not exhaustive or exclusive. Lots of questions that we have for a long time had about students, or students pose, that we don't know the answers to, or we don't know adequately and completely the answers to. And so learning analytics might, in concert with other assessment approaches, help us gain insights into those spaces that we don't already know the answers to. There's just a few samples on this list, but as I said, there are many others in the Lila report. And of course, as I said, also that's not the full list, right? Like, we could always add questions to this list based on our individual and institutional needs and concerns. Questions about patterns of student library engagement and how that facilitates, or maybe doesn't, student learning and success. How we can learn about cohorts of students with unique library requirements based on discipline, year in school, other kinds of things. How can we personalize and customize services so that we're connecting as best we can with students? Things about time. When's the best time to roll out different kinds of engagements? And what do students need to gain agency over their own journeys? And what do our faculty and advisors need to help students with the curricular and co-curricular aspects of higher ed? So lots of different kinds of questions, definitely just a few examples here. And then also we generated, again in the Lila report and carried over into the class report, almost 100 user stories. So user stories, Becky, if you can highlight the top, click one more time. Maybe, yeah, there we go, thank you. Highlighted in pink here, we have models for user stories. If you haven't worked with user stories before, they can be really powerful in articulating clearly what you want to get out of a system or a process. So they're usually formatted in one of these three ways. I can never decide which one I like the best. That's why you're looking at three. But essentially it's, as a person, I want to do a thing so that why I want to do it, or purpose. In the cases of library engagement, learning analytics, it's usually to be able to do an activity, know something, have an awareness, take an action. And there's almost 100 user stories in the Lila report. There's a couple examples here. And if you can click one more time, Becky, I should be able to share, yes, the users that we focused on in that report, including students, faculty, librarians. There's a lot about librarians because that's most of who was in the room, academic advisors, institutional researchers, and institutional leaders. And again, those user stories are offered as a starting place. They're not exhaustive or exclusive either. So we're going to have you engage in a few minutes with some user stories and some research questions, but we're not quite there yet. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ken to talk about tricky places.
Thank you very much, Megan, for laying out the why of all of this so clearly in our user story. We now have a very firm why. I do want to spend a little time kind of in the middle of our talk this afternoon going over and highlighting the concerns that so many of us have about some of the tricky places in analytics. This is of course, a very, there are very few clear, crisp, and universally agreed upon answers in learning analytics in general, even outside of the library and certainly within the library. And so in the next couple of slides, I'm going to walk through a handful of areas, not really opposites, but some themes that we have seen emerge and that are common in discussions about this. None of these are A, B, either or answers. They're not true or false, but they really represent points on a continuum, not even at the ends of those continua, but ways to think about it and sort of things that might help you put your answers or your concerns into an alignment with others within the library or your campuses, or more broadly across the universe of institutions. These often feel like binary choices. It can often come across, and you can start thinking that, well, I do this or I don't do this, or this is good or this is bad. And while there certainly may be points based on your own personal beliefs, your professional and organizational policies and practices and procedures where those answers are as cut and dried as that, quite often they are far more nuanced. So let's go over a couple of these. So first, and probably one that is near and dear to many of us in the library community, is how we could handle privacy issues. And again, these aren't meant to be diametrically opposed views, but there's one trend that we should, if we are going to keep any data, we should only keep completely de-identified and anonymized data. So this is, this certainly has its purposes in many places. This is how you can count interactions in a certain kind of category. And it maximizes the opportunities to not risk any sharing of information about someone that wasn't completely 100% intended. On the other hand, if you wanted to proceed and do some data collection, but you needed to know for the purposes of the research project, something about the individuals involved in it, then you might think about, the other option might be to, when you have some kind of identified data, you should establish secure data enclaves, places that are constructed to be hard to get data out of once it is in, certainly by unauthorized individuals. You can use some level of abstraction to mask who the individual is, but maybe identify them as part of a cohort that's large enough to make it difficult to re-identify that data point. And there are some questions that go much farther beyond just how many times was my service used, or how many people crossed the front door of the library, or those questions that really lead themselves to counting. As opposed to research and inquisition into the why, the what, and the outcome, importantly. So, and there are certainly lots of space in the middle, and there's probably space on the outside of both of these. Certainly, if don't keep anything period ever, or when we need to keep it, in even more secure than a secure data enclave, and build very robust policies around that. Another kind of area to think about relates to, if you do know things about your students that go beyond, that have any sort of direct connection to individuals or smaller cohorts of students, how we as librarians can handle the responsibility of this. If we do know more, then then we have the possibility to tailor services, to offer new services, or develop new ways to interact with those students, or in different places, different media. And if we don't know more, then we are continuing on the status quo, of course. So you might think of this again as sort of not endpoints, but somewhere along that continuum. Is that no, we don't need to do this. This is not something that our library needs to have. We don't need detailed information about our students. In contrast, we might think about having, if we had more detailed information about our students, we may be able to make decisions and take actions with them and on their behalf. So if we recognize that there were certain service areas that were being differently utilized or underutilized or overutilized by certain communities, overutilized may not be a problem, but then we could figure out why, and why the difference particularly, and how, if that difference actually is a difference with a distinction, how we can make that make it better if that is in fact a problem. How can we provide better services to groups of students along the way? Similarly, how could we use data to understand student learning at a detailed level? Now, in many ways, we as higher education institutions, and even to the extent that libraries have been involved at all, have focused on persistence, retention, velocity, completion, things that are really campus concerns about students. Campuses want to be able to say that, yes, our students succeed, and here are the perhaps easy to measure, but here are the metrics we use to say that. Our students get through in 4 years or 5 years. They come back after their first semester. They get through on time. They complete their courses, that kind of thing. And kind of in another spin on that, we could explore data about learning outcomes as they're assessed in courses by faculty or librarian judgment. So it's not just the fact that a goal, an arbitrary goal, or even a kind of a fact-based goal is met, students graduated and so long, but they did in fact learn better research skills. They did in fact produce better educational outputs. And they were able to take the things that the library taught them and presented to them and use them in the course of their learning. This would be completely typical in a more traditional class setting, where the faculty member might be very interested in, well, I'm giving a lecture, do my students understand it? Not just can they pass the test, but does the research paper that they build based on that lecture contain those ideas, those concepts, those tools or techniques? We often are a bit divorced in libraries from the actual outputs, but without any sort of data or connection, it is very difficult for us to understand what those connections are and how we can better enable the students on campus to do their own jobs, their learning better. How could we use data to enact equity and inclusion efforts? Now, I think this is one of the places where there is a tremendous amount of intersection between and perhaps highlighting some challenges about traditional librarian values. On the one hand, we are rightly concerned about individual privacy and data protection of users' data. On the other, we are exceptionally interested and desirous to make sure that we are providing the right services to the right time without any reflection of who is asking the question. We try to provide service equally. We try to provide service not just to all comers equally, but in a way that works and is helpful to all the individuals that we interact with. So a couple of strains here. One is that often our data about groups of students within the kind of the broad slices that we might have is very non-existent or very simplistic. We know that we served a bunch of undergrads. We know that we served a group of students that were in this course because we went to that course and we taught it. That kind of thing. So we aren't able to make any fine-grained distinctions or tuning to what we do. On the other hand, we might have a possibility for data about groups of students that reflects intersectional identities, race, gender, economic status, major, courses enrolled in, years in schools, all of these topics that might help us develop learning and develop services around our collections and our capabilities that actually help groups that are unidentified and underserved or in a way that we cannot now. I think it's really important that we don't, as a profession, completely design for average. And when we don't maintain some awareness of the distinctions among large groups of students for whatever sets of reasons, it's very hard to make sure that we're designing to serve their needs in the service-oriented, best faith effort that we can make to improve everybody's interaction to the library and everybody's use of library resources and materials. A couple more. How can we honor and balance labor? assessment metrics, assessment processes are very time consuming, both for the librarians who conduct them and often for the individuals who participate in assessment in being the ones providing the evaluation or describing their experience. So often we as librarians rely on assessment approaches that are labor intensive for the students or for the people being assessed. And we do surveys, we do focus groups, we do that kind of thing. However, we could, in a contrasting way, we might be able to take a less labor-intensive approach for the students themselves, and to use analytics data and careful analysis to identify the areas that are really worth focusing in on in great detail. So we could cast a wide net that's very labor-intensive, or we could focus that effort in where we have otherwise identified particular needs, particular concerns, and particular opportunities for improvement. And the final point that I will mention in this little overview is, a question about who should be collecting and accessing the data. In some cases, it defaults to the supplier community, all the vendors and content providers and service providers that libraries work with. Often mediated by contracts and licensing, perhaps institutional researchers. And that, has I think a library-sized hole in it right there, that there is no data that relates to us, and there is no us at the table when deciding how things could be better managed, should be stored, should be accessed. On the other hand, if we are collecting and accessing the data with the students themselves in mind, with librarians ourselves in mind, and with researchers in mind, to make sure that we are doing things in truly an equitable and fair way, then that might give us a completely different set of opportunities and options to understand the landscape of our services and how they actually work in the real world. So that is that's just a few of the many issues that are on top of mind, or bottom or middle of mind, but somewhere in mind. But with that, we want to turn around a little bit and have you play with some of these topics a little bit. So Becky.
Thanks, Ken. So now that you've had some time to listen and think a little bit about what is learning analytics, the role it can play in supporting student learning, and some tricky spaces, we thought it might be helpful and hopefully a little fun to put this into your hands for a few minutes and allow you to interact with some of the considerations you and your colleagues might encounter and work through in your own libraries or institutions. So we've created 3 different sorting activities related to potential library data sources that may be included in learning analytics, the research questions that Megan mentioned earlier in our presentation, and the user stories. Remember, the user stories begin with the user, followed by the want, and then in order to achieve an outcome, solve a problem, or meet a need. So on the next slide, we're going to assign you to a specific activity, a card sorting activity based on your last name. And Ken and Megan are going to put the links to the activities in chat. And in each activity, you'll be asked to sort the items into high priority, low priority, and red flags. And by the high and low priority, I'm think about this in terms of priority as it relates to your ability in the library to enact or enable change. In these activities, there's no right or wrong answers. These are really just starting places for you to begin thinking about some of these things, and then perhaps you can carry some of these ideas back to your own libraries. So here we are with our different assignments. So A through I, have you work on data sources, last names J through R, work on the research questions, and S through Z, work on the user stories. And as you're working on these activities, please leave this webinar window open up in one tab and then open up your activity in a separate tab so we don't lose you. And I am going to be playing a Coldplay song that's about 4 minutes and 20 seconds or so. When that song ends, then we'll reconvene. So we'll see you in just a few minutes.
You're muted, Becky.
I do that all the time. Sorry, folks. So let's go ahead and reconvene. If you're almost finished with your card sorting activity, go ahead and finish that up. But whoops, I got it there. So let's just take a quick little look at some of the results. I'm not going to go through each report and we'll look at all items individually. We just don't have time for that. But I am going to open up a couple of the reports just so you can kind of see what things look like after your analyses. So you can see here, this first one I clicked on is the data sources, some potential data sources that might be considered for learning analytics. And a way to interpret this report is you can see like, should we include subject, faculty, librarian consultations, those reference consultations? You can see that 45 of our card sorters designated that as a high priority, something that they think would be really useful to include in learning analytics. 7 others take that as a red flag, like, no, we don't want to touch that. And 5 others rated as low priority, thinking maybe perhaps that is not going to be super helpful in enabling decision making based on learning analytics. And so you can see here that there are several where there's kind of scaling towards the high priority. If you scroll down a little bit, you can see like reserves collections or reserves usage. It's kind of skewing more towards the low priority. Let's see. And then there's really mixed results. And that really is to be expected, that people are going to have different comfort levels of what should be included, what should not be included, and different perceptions about which items are going to really help enable decision making. So those kinds of things are things that I would recommend you take back to your libraries and your institutions and think about those things collectively as a group. Similarly, the research questions, as one would expect, the results, there are several that are skewing towards a high priority, others that have those red flags, and then like others that are kind of skewing more towards the low priority. And with respect to the research questions and user stories, I'm going to click back there. So we're looking at research questions. You see overall impact and you think, well, what does that mean? That's just a limitation of the card sorting tool. So if you want to see the whole question, you would go to this key down here for research questions. So overall impact is, do academic libraries impact student learning? And so now you can see that 80% of folks agreed that that was a high priority item. So like I say, you can take a look at these after the fact. These are all user-friendly links that you should be able to go back to and look at on your own. So now let's switch gears a little bit and talk for a few minutes about the unique roles that libraries can play in this emerging landscape. Librarians should be essential partners in learning analytics initiatives and play a role in deciding how things are going to work in your libraries, rather than have others at your institutions decide everything. And then we try to figure out how to fit into this after the fact. So one of the important opportunities or key opportunities is to be communicators. I just encourage you all to engage in discussions in learning analytics across your institution, in your libraries, but more broadly across your whole higher ed organization. Convene and participate in institutional or even cross-institutional discussions about learning analytics, what it is, how do you want to participate, and kind of talk to, like I talked to Ken and Megan and others across the country about how things are going. What are they doing at their universities or their institutions? We as librarians also they have a wonderful opportunity to help shape policies governing the deployment and use of learning analytics. Because this is still in the emerging field, there's time for us to help play a role in how things are created, how, you know, the policies, the security, data security, the privacy. I've been seeing a lot of comments and questions and concerns about confidentiality, privacy, things like that. So this is an opportunity for us to play a role in figuring out how those things work. I encourage you to think about how your library can participate in institutional learning analytics and determine what data makes sense to contribute or withhold from learning analytics systems. Those of you who started those data sources, you know, there are a lot of things that's like, yeah, that really makes sense to include. And then perhaps there's a handful of others like, no, I'm not comfortable with that, or it just really is not going to provide meaningful data. You know, and we have the opportunity to create meaning from data, consult on what data is ingested into the systems, but also provide expertise in data science, curation, stewardship of data, visualization, the metadata. You know, we're really good at that stuff. So it would be great to play a role at the university about how that is handled. And then, of course, demonstrate and articulate the value of information revealed by learning analytics. And then finally, act on results. Rather than be passive contributors of data, we can use those data to make decisions to improve our services or our programs or our resources. And if it makes sense as we figure this out, to figure out how interventions can take place down the road, identified by learning analytics, you know, we're in early days, so all of these things are up for consideration. And now let's think just a little bit about next steps, and then we'll go into some final wrap-ups and save some time for Q&A. So learning analytics efforts are definitely proliferating across higher ed, and in response, we can choose a wide variety of actions ranging from inaction to accelerated engagement. And I understand that doing nothing might be kind of alluring. It seems pretty easy to avoid or resist jumping into this and continuing with the status quo. On the other hand, though, you can determine that participating in learning analytics may be worth investigating and exploring. So as you consider those next steps, think about, you know, we all are on a huge learning curve. So, you know, you can improve your professional awareness and discussion by engaging in readings, attending conferences, attending webinars, things like that. Stay informed and be forthright about current data practices. Invite stakeholders to engage in the conversations, whether that's faculty, administrators, faculty across your, or students. Just have those conversations. And communicate and negotiate with your institutional partners about what data is gathered, how it's maintained and stored and used. Determine whether and how to integrate opt-in or opt-out choices, and be transparent about what data is gathered and how it is being used. Situate learning analytics among other assessment approaches. Remember, learning analytics isn't the end-all be-all. It is just one form of assessment or information. There's still a great value in the qualitative measures, the focus groups, the interviews, the observations. So learning analytics is one of many. Jump in and get into those conversations at the institutional level. You may have to invite yourself into the conversation, but I think it's really important that we make sure we do have a seat at the table. identify and analyze questions or problems that may merit a learning analytics approach. Things like those research questions and user stories that we investigated just a few minutes ago. Envision what data, or think about what data makes sense to include in the learning analytics. Sorry, I lost my word there. In the learning analytics arena. And explore interoperability standards, meaning there are standards so that all of our data could flow into a data lake, and the data can all perhaps talk to each other without a lot of data management. So explore how your campus may be able to utilize those standards. Identify those key user stories, the things that really make sense for your library, and then pursue pilot studies. At my university, that's where we are right now. Just kind of still in that research phase, figuring out what works and what doesn't, what data makes sense, what kind of things we want to know. And now I'm going to turn it over to Megan for some final wrap-ups.
Final wrap-ups. All right. Thank you for hanging with us. So one of the things we wanted to leave you with is a way to continue this conversation past what we can do in this hour. So we wanted to get you started, but then also give you some pointers for future growth. So the three of us put together some resources that I think might help sort of spur you forward. The first one pulls away from or continues maybe the conversation of what Becky was just talking about the roles that libraries can have in this space, the space that we think of as being sort of in other parts of the academy, but we also can contribute to. So going back to 2015, Austin Booth and Dean Hendricks wrote this piece, Libraries and Institutional Data Analytics, Challenges and Opportunities, that lays out a number of library roles in this space. There's also a short follow-up that thank you, Ken has just contributed to the chat. So I hope that you check those out about the ways in which we can provide unique perspectives that should be valued by the rest of our campus. Not that we are the only ones with those perspectives, but we may have a unique flavor to it. The next thing I wanted to point you towards is that Leela report, right? It's really long. It's like 100 and some pages, but it's well organized with headings. So I would encourage you to delve into that, think about how you can get started, how you can start to envision this space. It's hard to imagine things that haven't come before. It's hard to imagine what we would do if we had information that we haven't had previously. So having that dialogue on your campus with your peers across the country, at conferences and so on and so forth is really essential to getting at what should we do and what should we definitely not do. There's a section 7, at the end of the report that also lays out some beginning discussion questions. So if you don't know where to get started, that's a good place. On the next slide, we have a screenshot from the class report, which we didn't talk about as much today, but also gets into a lot of these questions that we've been discussing here amongst the panelists, but also in chat. It has questions posed throughout it. This time I learned my lesson and I sprinkled the questions through the formatting of the report. Questions around data collection, retention and use, interoperability, standards for getting our different systems to talk to each other, how students can be engaged in shaping this work, how do we need to deal with our privacy policies in terms of making sure that we're living our policies and revising where we're not, and looking to the future, and research questions that need answering, and so much more. So that's another source. And then I think there's 2 more. Yes. In the chat, I've been noticing some questions that kind of combine these 2 roles that we have. We have many roles, but 2 of the roles are as educators in academic libraries and also privacy. So this paper engages that question really even more directly than maybe in Leela, and also it's engaged very directly in class as well. But how can librarians honor privacy values within this context? So I point you to that. It also has questions that you can use for discussion in that piece. And then finally, I wanted to point you to the ACRL Learning Analytics Toolkit, which brings together lots of other resources. So those were a handful that we thought would be good starting points, but there are lots when you're ready to dig in. And this is a good clearinghouse for getting those materials in one spot. So at this point, we've got about 5 or 6 minutes left, and I wanted to turn it over to our hosts to help us sort of prioritize and engage the questions that you were all kind enough to leave us in chat So thank you very much for listening, and let's now get into your questions, concerns, thoughts, and issues.
Thank you. I have a lot to work with here. We had great conversation going on in the chat. So much happening. There was a great question at the end as to, is there an executive summary? I don't know if there was anything provided in your links that was just an executive summary of your report, but that was
each of the reports has an executive summary, because what's worth reading is also worth reading in 2 pages or less, right? So those are there too.
So most of the questions came during Ken's section, and it was, most of the questions are around privacy. So I'll throw a couple out there. How can you have privacy and individualized data? And are there opt-in procedures, or is it assumed that since you're part of the same institution, you're automatically involved? And Megan, that came through at your part of the presentation.
Okay, can you restate it one time? There was a technical issue in my chat. Can you say it one more time?
And probably a cat meowing as it walked by.
Yeah, right. And if we can stop sharing so I can see everybody, that'd be great too.
How can you have privacy and individualized data? Are there opt-in procedures? And is it assumed that when you're part of the same institution that you are involved?
Oh, great. Yeah. So that would be, and Becky and Ken, feel free to chime in. Just because the question came in from me doesn't mean I'm the best person to answer it. So I think that the opt-in piece is dependent on your institution, and also with library data, what your library has decided to do. So that's not something that we can answer universally. I will say that generally speaking, there is a lot of data that is automatically kept on our campuses by virtue of participation. And at some point, the students agree to that, and probably fine print. That brings up a whole other webcast on data literacy and what we can do in that space to help students understand what they are or are not agreeing to. But I think that this is difficult space because, or difficult question to answer because it is so different across campuses. In some cases, an opt-in, opt-out might be possible. I think Ken could probably speak to ways in which they're engaging with that at the University of Michigan. And so there are pieces that we can pull off of even the sort of what feels monolithic, academic experience at a university, that there might be some things that we can do opt in and opt out. One thing I would advise everyone to look out for are places where our campuses might be saying that students can opt out, but what they're really opting out of is IRB approved research, and the data is still maintained. So making sure that opt-out really means opt-out is something else to take a look at. In order to participate in most learning management systems, you have to engage them. And so that data is retained for some period of time. So I encourage people to think about that. But I think also privacy and having individual data, I think that I did a paper on this. I think we can do both. So I think that we can have individual data and still keep it private. And I think that we know that that is true based on what others have done in all different aspects of our lives, from healthcare information to all kinds of other sort of aspects. Now, are there data breaches? Yes, you can't go a day in the news without a data breach. And so you have to think carefully about what data do we need to know to answer those important questions to serve our students, and what would we never want to know. And that's one thing that we were, because of time, we weren't able to get into as much depth today, but we have talked about, the three of us in other venues, and the class paper engages this specifically, is what, in terms of libraries, what data do we need to know in order to help our students? And so we want to collect it, and we want to take care of it, and we want to protect it. And with personnel, policies, procedures, governance, all of the things that we have at our disposal. And what are the things that we don't ever want to know? Right. So thinking about the difference between knowing that a student engaged with a resource that's on a course reading list, which is not private anyway, versus something they did for personal exploration. I think most of us would come down on different answers in those two different scenarios. So it's a really complicated and complex issue. Both of the papers get into this somewhat, and others are exploring these issues as well. But I'm talking more than my fair share. Ken and Becky, do you want to chime in there?
I can just say a brief word about opting in and opting out. We at the University of Michigan Library has been kind of a default opt-in with no opt-out, like many libraries who collect any data. And this is mostly transaction logs, so things that you've done, web logs, and stuff like that. We just recently this summer activated a true opt-in, opt-out function for the library's checkout history. Which lets you, say, I want my checkout history to be recorded, or no, I don't. And if you had previously had one, because everybody had one previously, you can delete that or choose to continue it. So that's been really interesting to look at. We're actually doing some research into people's choices based on that, which I don't have any results yet because we just started it, but then I'm quite interested to see how that goes. And I hope that we can extend that to other data collection areas. And I know we're over time, so I'll pipe down.
Becky, is there anything you want to add before we unfortunately probably need to wrap up?
I would just like to add that it was Manda, and I can't remember, maybe Manda Sexton early on in our talk in the chat mentioned that at her university is like only 5 people have access to the identifiable data. And that's really how it is here. And, there's so many precautions in place that it's only the Office of Institutional Research that has the key between the student IDs and the like they create a different ID that we use when we're analyzing. So we keep our data under a lock and key very carefully. And with respect to opt-in, opt-out, we haven't figured that out. We're kind of like U of M was, it's kind of like we all opt in by default, and it's just stated in university policies, but we really, that's something we need to work on at our institution, is how to allow students the privilege to opt out. And then I just took a class with Lisa Hinchliff and Kyle Jones about prioritizing privacy. And one of our readings discussed the idea of allowing a student to opt out of an intervention. So, like include everyone's data so that we have a complete picture of the student body and how they're engaging, but then allow students the freedom to say, no, I don't want people to intervene with me. So that's another thing that I hope that universities will begin to explore, is how to make that happen.
Yeah, one thing I just want to tag on very, very briefly is that we're already seeing in the chat, in our conversation, right where we went, this sort of false choice. We can keep the data and risk privacy, or we cannot keep the data and uphold privacy. And we need to think through that, as Ken said, on a continuum, right? We also, if we don't know anything about our students, we design for average. We might do harm by not understanding our students adequately. The push across higher education assessment right now is to disaggregate data so that we can understand better what's happening to student groups. So there's a trade-off between some of these issues, and the answer isn't yes or no, right? It's not a binary answer. There's space in between, which is why we hope that all of you will go back to your institutions and start chatting about these things, discussing these things, think about them rigorously, because the time will come when we'll need to make decisions, and we want to have thought about everything thoroughly first.
And Megan, that seems like a perfect loop close, bringing it all the way back around to the title. Nicely done. And we are at the end of our time today. So attendees, thank you so much for making time in your day to join us. Please do join me in thanking the panelists for their time. Panelists, special thanks to y'all, especially because there was a lot of back end chatter to try to figure out some sticky camera issues, for lack of a better way to put it, where we kept getting stuck on Megan. You look great. We did manage to resolve that along the way, but thank you to the attendees too for your patience with that while we had some technical difficulties. A reminder, you will see this recording come out in a couple days. We'll confer with our panelists about any additional links or things from the chat that they would like to include along with that. And since I know we had some more questions that we weren't able to get to, I imagine our panelists will be open to us including their email addresses directly in that email when we send it out too. So please do take a moment, if you didn't have a chance, to hit that evaluation link that I've dropped in the chat a few times. And otherwise, we hope you have a great day. And thank you again to our panelists for their expertise on this challenge.
Lisa had to drop off.
Uh-oh, are we being recorded again, Gina? I don't know if there's a way to stop that.
Anyway, it was great to have a heads up that we were having those camera issues. So thanks to Lisa for sharing that with us, because there's no way to see, right? So
Right. And that's why I started ferreting out the committee members with our group in the audience, like, what are you saying? So
Yeah, that was
again,
great.
thank you for that. I wish there was a way in Zoom where you could parse like the chat boxes to be two separate things. I know that's challenging when y'all are trying to watch the chat, and then we've got so much host and panelist stuff going, but
that was fun. It was really nice to see some people active in the chat as well. So
they were. They
Yeah,
were
it was
very active,
quite,
weren't they?
it was quite active.
Yeah.
Which is great.
Indeed. Well, I will circle back with y'all via email after this just to see. I know Leanne pulled a list of links that were dropped in the chat throughout the presentation. We can ping those back to y'all, and if you would like to add them as a portion of
I
your
have a
slide,
Word doc. I can send you the Word doc.
Okay, excellent. That's great. And y'all had already shared you're comfortable with your slides going out, right? So that's okay.
Yeah, Becky, do we want to close? And Ken, do we want to delete or send her a copy? Do you want? We've got some
Yeah.
hidden slides and some extra template slides in there still.
Yeah, we should probably, and yes.
Sounds perfect. And take your time. Again, ACRL will hold on sending anything out till they get the go ahead from us.
Okay, and what's the best format to get it to you, in PDF or just the Google Slides link? Or
The Google Slides link, they prefer for it to be hosted. So
Okay, awesome.
yeah, thank you again so much, y'all. And this is a topic near and dear and of great interest to me. So always enjoy hearing any constellation of folks talking about this, but especially folks who've been as engaged as y'all. So
Oh, well, thanks.
Apparently it's not a big topic in Canada, so I was very interested to learn about it. So
Oh,
yeah.
Maybe we'll send it over to you, like pollution and other things.
Indeed. Well, I hope you all have a great afternoon. If you think of any other questions, let me know. And like I said, in a few minutes, I'll have an email your way just with reminders for follow-ups.
All right.
thank you
thanks
so much
all.
for the opportunity.
Thank you, everybody. It was
Okay, thanks.
fascinating. Thank you.
Bye-bye.